Good evening, my friends, and welcome back to Silent History. Tonight, we begin another long and winding journey through the past. This channel is where we leave the noise of the modern world behind, close our eyes, and drift into stories that shaped humanity. Stories that soothe, stories that intrigue, and stories that perhaps help you find rest. Before we begin, I'd like to ask something small but meaningful. If you enjoy what I do here, these long, quiet explorations of history told in a gentle way, take a moment to like this video. It really does help me know you'd like more of them. And if you're new, you can subscribe so you'll always have a story waiting for you at bedtime. And one more thing. I always find it fascinating to see how far this community stretches. So, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Maybe you're in the United States winding down after work. Maybe you're in Europe settling in for the night. Or perhaps you're in Asia, letting history carry you through the early morning. Tell me your place and time. It always feels like we're connected in one big map of listeners, spread across the world but gathered here together in silence. So now, dim the lights. Settle into your blanket. Perhaps switch on a soft fan or let some rain sounds play quietly in the background. Tonight's story will be long. A story to last through hours. So you don't need to worry about the clock. Just let the words guide you, let your mind wander, and if you fall asleep, that's perfectly fine. The story will keep flowing without you. And tonight, we begin with shadows. Not the shadows of forests or castles, but the shadows cast by figures whose names were rarely written down. Men who slipped through corridors and alleys, who lived without glory and died without monuments. Tonight, we begin with the world of medieval assassins. When we imagine assassins of the past, the mind often drifts to fiction. Perhaps you picture a hooded figure leaping from rooftops, a silent blade flashing under the moonlight, a master of martial arts trained since childhood in hidden temples. It is a romantic picture, almost glamorous. But history, as it so often does, tells us a different story. Being a medieval assassin was not glamorous. It was not noble. In fact, it was not even really a career. It was the final stop on a life that had already gone horribly wrong. No one in the Middle Ages woke up and thought, I want to grow up to be an assassin. Children dreamed of being farmers, soldiers, craftsmen, or monks. But assassins? They were the people who had fallen through the cracks of society. Peasants who had nothing to lose. Thieves who had nothing to return to. Disgraced soldiers with nowhere left to march. Becoming an assassin was never a dream. It was a desperate last resort. The truth is, if you had wealth, or a title, or even something as modest as a small farm and a few goats, you did not become an assassin. You might hire one if you were ambitious and cruel enough, but you would never wield the blade yourself. Assassins came from those who had no land, no reputation, and no future. They were invisible to the census, nameless in the tax records, and forgotten by their families. And yet, in the shadows, they were sought after, because there is always someone willing to pay for blood. Imagine you've just escaped prison. Maybe you stole food. Maybe you deserted from your army. Maybe you were caught in a feud and had to run. You wander into a tavern, ragged, hungry, with eyes that look both desperate and sharp. A man slides a coin purse across the table. He whispers a name, not the baker, not the farmer, but a baron, a bishop, a nobleman with guards at every door. That is how it began, not with training, not with ceremony, but with a whisper and a coin. And once you accepted, your life changed forever. You became someone who could never again live in the daylight, someone whose friends would drift away, someone who slept with one eye open and one hand on a dagger. Another myth we must break is the idea of training. Movies show assassins practicing for years, perfecting their craft. Reality? There were no secret manuals, no guilds of professional killers holding orientation sessions. There was no graduation ceremony, no wise old teacher explaining how to walk silently or slip poison into a goblet. If you learned anything, it was through trial and error error usually meant death. If you had been a soldier, perhaps you knew how to hold a blade properly. If you were once a thief, maybe you could sneak through alleys without being noticed. But most assassins were improvisers. They did not master martial arts. They simply did what was necessary to survive one more day. And survival was often luck, not skill. The weapons of assassins were not elegant either. Forget retractable wrist blades or curved daggers glowing with jewels. An assassin's blade was whatever they could steal or afford. A rusted knife, a dagger taken from a guard, perhaps even a rope used more often for climbing than killing. The weapons of assassins were not elegant either. Forget retractable wrist blades or curved daggers glowing with jewels. An assassin's blade was whatever they could steal or afford. A rusted knife, a dagger taken from a guard, perhaps even a rope used more often for climbing than killing. Sometimes they carried poison, but that too was unreliable. It was not neat and efficient like we imagine. Poisons came from plants, mushrooms, or minerals mixed without precision. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it left the target vomiting for days but alive. And sometimes the assassin himself died by accident. Most often, it was the dagger. Quick, close, and dangerous. You might wonder, how did they even get close to their targets? The answer was disguise. Not the clever masks of a theater, but simple, desperate disguises. A ragged cloak to look like a pilgrim. A monk's robe stolen from a laundry line. Sometimes even a servant's outfit, clumsy and ill-fitting. Disguises had their limits. Servants knew each other. Guards remembered faces. One wrong look, one unfamiliar step, and suspicion spread like fire. And in the Middle Ages, suspicion was often enough to kill you. So assassins lived in constant tension, always pretending, always hiding, never certain if the eyes watching them belonged to someone fooled or someone about to shout for guards. And for all this risk, what did they gain? A handful of coins, enough to buy food, maybe shelter for a few weeks, enough to survive, but never enough to escape the life of shadows. Worse, payment was never guaranteed. Many assassins were betrayed by their own employers. The deal was simple: kill this man, and you'll be paid. But when the deed was done, the client would vanish, or worse, send someone else to silence the assassin forever. After all, what's cheaper, handing over gold or handing over a knife? To survive, assassins learned the hardest rule of all: trust no one, not your client, not your companions, not even yourself. And so, the life of an assassin was not just dangerous, it was lonely. You could not form friendships, you could not start a family, you could not stay in one place for long. At the inn, you always sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, watching the door. You never drank too much, you never spoke your real name. If someone asked, you said you were a traveling merchant or a pilgrim or a monk, anything but the truth. because the truth was a death sentence. And what happened if you failed? If you missed your strike, or the target survived, or you were caught sneaking through a corridor? Failure was not forgiven. Failure meant torture, confession, and execution, and not quick execution either. In the Middle Ages, punishments were designed to terrify. Fire, ropes, wheels, the instruments of pain were many, and none were merciful. So every mission was life or death. Success meant a few coins and a few more weeks alive. Failure meant an end too horrible to describe. And here lies the cruel irony. Even if you succeeded, you were not safe. Killing the target meant escaping the guards, fleeing the city, changing your name, and praying no one connected you to the deed. Success painted a target on your back. Success made you dangerous to your employer and therefore expendable. In this world, victory was survival, nothing more. So why do assassins fascinate us so much? Perhaps because they lived in shadows we cannot imagine. They walked the thin line between life and death every single day. They remind us of the fragility of survival, of how power can be toppled by a whisper and a blade. But they also remind us of something darker, that those who lived in shadows often vanished into them, leaving no name, no monument, only fear and rumor. And this is where our journey into the world of assassins begins. Already, the myths crumble. The hooded figure becomes a desperate man with a rusted blade. The glamorous fantasy fades into hunger, paranoia, and betrayal. Tonight, as we continue, we'll walk deeper into that world. We'll explore their disguises, their poisons, their methods of escape. We'll step into the taverns where whispers of contracts passed in the dark. And we'll see how the life of an assassin was not a story of glory, but a story of survival. So let your eyes grow heavy. Let the words drift around you like shadows. The assassins of history may be long gone, but their echoes remain, hidden in the corners of time. The life of an assassin was built not on steel, but on silence. Silence in the way they moved, silence in the way they waited, silence in the way they disappeared after deed was done. In truth, silence was their only armor, for if anyone saw them clearly, if anyone spoke their name aloud, their fragile existence would collapse like a shadow when the sun rises. Most assassins spent more time waiting than striking. To kill a man was quick, a flash of a blade, a swallow of poisoned wine. But to reach that moment, that could take days, even weeks. Picture the assassin crouched behind a crumbling wall near the castle kitchens, waiting for a guard to turn his head, or lying in the reeds outside a noble's villa, mosquitoes biting his skin, eyes fixed on the torchlight beyond the wall, or standing in a crowded marketplace, pretending to admire figs and cloth, while in truth his gaze follows the merchant prince who passes through each morning. Waiting was the hardest part. Hunger gnawed at the belly, fear gnawed at the mind. One cough at the wrong moment, one sneeze in the wrong shadow, and the chance was lost forever. Yet patience was their greatest weapon. History books rarely record the names of assassins, but their whispers echo in the places where they once found work. The tavern was their office. Imagine the air thick with smoke from tallow candles, the sour smell of ale, the raucous laughter of sailors. In a corner booth, two men lean close. One is dressed plainly, but the purse he carries clinks with silver. The other has eyes like a starving wolf, wary and sharp. A name is spoken, never written. A deadline is given, never sealed with ink. And the deal is sealed with nothing more than a nod. Such meetings were dangerous for both sides. The employer risked being betrayed if the assassin was captured. The assassin risked being cheated if the employer refused to pay. Trust was a fantasy. Only fear kept the bargain alive, and yet these whispered contracts shaped kingdoms. A single blade in the night could undo years of diplomacy, topple a ruler, or spark a war. We spoke earlier of disguises, but let us linger there, for deception was an art in itself. The assassin might shave his beard and pose as a monk seeking alms. He might smear dirt across his face, tear his cloak, and pretend to be a beggar by the roadside. In one story, an assassin even disguised himself as a corpse, lying still among the dead until nightfall when he rose to strike. But deception was dangerous. To pass as a servant, you needed to know the habits of servants, which door they used, which words they spoke, even how they bowed before their masters. To pass as a pilgrim, you needed to know the prayers, the gestures, the symbols. A slip of the tongue could mean discovery. So assassins studied not just their targets, but the roles they played. They learned fragments of Latin to pass as monks, or copied the way a farmer carried a basket. They were actors in a deadly play, and one mistake ended the performance forever. Poison, too, deserves its own place in our long, quiet story. In the medieval imagination, poison was the assassin's weapon of choice, invisible, silent, leaving no struggle. But in truth, it was unreliable and dangerous. Poison might come from deadly herbs like hemlock or belladonna. It might be scraped from mushrooms in the forest or ground from minerals into powder. But dosage was uncertain. Too little, and the target lived. Too much, and suspicion was raised. Sometimes the poisoner tasted death before the victim did. There are records of nobles fallen ill at banquets, their lips turning pale, their breath shallow. But there are also tales of failed attempts, where the victim merely vomited, cursed his cook, and lived to tighten his guard. For every whispered story of success, there were countless failures buried in silence. And in those failures, the assassin often became the next corpse. Nothing haunted assassins more than betrayal, for betrayal was the currency of their trade. An employer might pay an assassin to kill his rival, then, once the deed was done, pay another assassin to silence the first. A guard might pretend to look away, only to seize the killer at the crucial moment. Companions might flee, leaving one man alone to face capture, and betrayal could come from within. Fear made men talk. Torture made them scream out names. And in the Middle Ages, few secrets stayed buried long. It is said that the greatest fear of an assassin was not death itself, but dying without the chance to strike back. To die betrayed without the dignity of choice was the cruelest fate of all, though nameless for the most part. A few assassins stepped into the faint light of history. In 1176, a group known as the Hashishin emerged from the mountains of Persia. They were not the lone desperate killers of Europe, but an organized sect, driven by faith and politics. Their assassins moved openly in cities, striking with daggers in marketplaces, even in mosques, disappearing into the crowd before guards could react. Their name gave us the word assassin itself. And yet, even they were hunted, feared, and finally crushed by Mongol armies. In medieval Europe, assassins were less organized, but equally feared. Chronicles speak of bishops stabbed in cathedrals, lords slain on the road, rivals poisoned in feasting halls. Few names survive, but the deeds linger. And so we come to the end of this chapter in our long night's journey. We have lingered with the assassins in their shadows. We have felt their hunger, their loneliness, their disguises, and their betrayals. We have seen how fragile survival was when your only trade was death. In our next chapter, we will turn from the shadows of alleys to the throne rooms of queens. From nameless men with daggers, we will step into the life of a woman whose name shook empires. Olympias, the Serpent Queen, the mother of Alexander the Great. But for now, let the echoes of the assassins fade into silence. They leave behind no monuments, no books, no families to mourn them. Only stories, only shadows, only the reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people in history are those we can barely see. So rest now, my friends. Let your eyelids grow heavy. The assassins are gone, but history still waits for us. And so, what reward awaited these shadowed figures? Gold, yes, but rarely enough to escape. Power? Never. Fame? Only as rumor, never as fact. Their true reward was survival. A day longer, a week more, a chance to eat and breathe and hide. That was the assassin's treasure, yet in whispers they gained another reward, fear. Their names were rarely written, but their presence lingered. A lord would hesitate before sitting at his banquet. A bishop would glance twice at the cup offered to him. Fear itself became the assassin's legacy. We may never know their true names, but assassins live on in the stories told about them. Around tavern fires, men whispered of killers who vanished like smoke, of daggers that struck without warning, of nobles who died with their lips still on the cup. Were these stories true? Sometimes. Often they were exaggerated. But in the medieval mind, it didn't matter. What mattered was the lesson. Beware the shadows. Trust no stranger. Keep your doors locked. Pray harder. And so, assassins became part of folklore as much as history. They were not heroes, not villains, but warnings. A reminder that even in the age of castles and knights, death could still slip quietly through the smallest crack. And so we come to the end of this chapter in our long night's journey. We have lingered with the assassins in their shadows. We have felt their hunger, their loneliness, their disguises, and their betrayals. We have seen how fragile survival was when your only trade was death. In our next chapter, we will turn from the shadows of alleys to the throne rooms of queens. From nameless men with daggers, we will step into the life of a woman whose name shook empires. Olympias, the Serpent Queen, the mother of Alexander the Great. But for now, let the echoes of the assassins fade into silence. They leave behind no monuments, no books, no families to mourn them, only stories, only shadows, only the reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people in history are those we can barely see. So rest now, my friends. Let your eyelids grow heavy. The assassins are gone, but history still waits for us. We leave behind the nameless shadows of medieval assassins, and now we step into the torchlight of a woman whose name has survived the centuries. A woman who shaped the destiny of kings, who believed her son was divine, and who carried herself as though touched by gods. Tonight, we sit with Olympias, mother of Alexander the Great, the Serpent Queen of Macedonia. Olympias was not born Olympias. Her name at birth was Polyxena, a princess of Epirus, a rugged land of mountains and forests to the west of Macedonia. Epirus was not a wealthy kingdom. It was not the shining Athens or the disciplined Sparta. It was wild, proud, and steeped in old traditions. Among those traditions were rituals of snakes, serpents that symbolized both death and rebirth, both danger and divinity. Olympias grew up in this atmosphere, surrounded by whispers of omens, prophecies, and the power of unseen forces. When she married Philip II of Macedonia, she stepped into a larger world. Macedonia was rising, uniting the Greek world under its banners. And soon, she would give birth to the boy who would be remembered as Alexander the Great. From the very beginning, Olympias wove myth around her son. She told stories that he was not merely Philip's child, but the child of Zeus himself. She filled his ears with visions of destiny, of lightning and lions, of a crown waiting beyond the horizon, and she used symbols. In Macedonian lore, Olympias was said to sleep with snakes winding across her bed like guardians. To outsiders, this was shocking. To her enemies, it was evidence of witchcraft. But to Olympias, it was power, a symbol that she was more than a woman, that she was touched by divine forces, and that her son was destined for greatness. She was not gentle. She was not nurturing in the way we imagine mothers today. She was fierce. Her love was not a comfort, it was a weapon. She sharpened Alexander's sense of destiny like a blade. She made him believe that he was no ordinary child. And in that belief, she gave the world its conqueror. Philip, Alexander's father, was a brilliant king and warrior. But even he feared Olympias. She was not a silent queen, smiling politely at banquets. She was fiery, outspoken, and ruthless. When rivals threatened her son's claim to the throne, Olympias acted. She orchestrated purges, arranged marriages, and sometimes even had enemies executed. Her battlefield was not the open plain, but the palace corridors. She fought with whispers, with priests, with omens, with poison if necessary, and she succeeded. When Philip was murdered, some say with her knowledge, though we cannot prove it, Alexander took the throne. Olympia stood behind him, not as a widow in mourning, but as a queen triumphant. Alexander's conquests carried him across Persia, into Egypt, and to the edges of India. His armies believed him divine. His generals bowed to him not just as king, but as something greater. And behind that belief was Olympias. It was she who had told him he was chosen. It was she who whispered of Zeus, of destiny, of gods walking among men. Without her, Alexander might have been just another ambitious prince. With her, he became legend. Even as Alexander marched far away, Olympias held power in Macedonia. She ruled as regent, issued commands, and defended his legacy at home. She was the guardian of the myth, the mother of the god. But power breeds enemies. When Alexander died suddenly in Babylon, his empire trembled. He had no adult heir. His generals divided his lands, and his mother became both a symbol and a target. In 317 BCE, Olympias found herself trapped in the coastal fortress of Pydna, surrounded by the army of Cassander, a rival who wanted her destroyed. The siege lasted months. Food dwindled, disease spread, allies abandoned her. But Olympias did not bend. She stood tall, regal, even as hunger hollowed her cheeks. To her enemies, she was still dangerous. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. Cassander hesitated. To kill her outright was to risk blasphemy. To strike down the woman who had given birth to the conqueror of the world, it carried the weight of sacrilege. So he offered her safety if she surrendered. But Olympias knew better. She had seen promises turn to ashes too many times. She refused. Eventually, her garrison broke. Her followers surrendered, and Olympias, unbending until the very end, was handed over to her enemies. Cassander did not kill her himself. Instead, he turned her over to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. They condemned her to death. But when the time came, none dared strike the first blow. She stood before them, frail, old, but still cloaked in myth. Her eyes burned with the same fire that had once shaken kings. These Macedonians had grown up hearing of her rituals, her visions, her snakes. They had once cheered her son as a god, and now here she stood, a woman, yes, but more than that, a symbol. No one wanted to be the one to cut her down, so Cassander sent foreigners, outsiders with no memory of her power, and it was they who finally struck her down. Her death was quiet, undignified, far from the throne, far from her son. But her shadow endured. Olympias died not as a queen in silks, but as a prisoner in dust. Yet history remembers her, not as a footnote, not as just a mother, but as a force of her own. She was ruthless, yes. She was accused of witchcraft, of murder, of manipulation, and yet she was also visionary. Without her, there is no Alexander the Great as we know him. Without her, there is no myth of the divine conqueror. Without her, there is no empire built on prophecy. Olympias did not wield the sword, but she wielded belief. And belief, as she proved, can be more powerful than armies. How do we judge her? Was she a villain, a murderer, a witch? Or was she a mother defending her child's destiny in a brutal world? Perhaps she was all of these things. Perhaps she was something else entirely. What is certain is this: Olympias was never irrelevant. She was never quiet history. She lived loudly, dangerously, fiercely. She carved her name into the story of empires, and long after her bones turned to dust, her legend endures. Even now, when we speak of Alexander, we feel the shadow of Olympias standing behind him. The Serpent Queen, always watching, always whispering, always reminding us that destiny is never born alone. It is born of mothers, of myths, of shadows that refuse to fade. And so we leave Olympias, her story told. From mountain princess to serpent queen, from mother of a god to prisoner in dust, her journey is one of power, belief, and ruthless survival. Rest now, my friends. Close your eyes and let her image fade into the night. For history is long, and our story continues still. Knossos was not a palace in the way we might imagine today. It was not one grand hall with shining columns and banners waving proudly. It was a city folded into itself, a palace that seemed to stretch forever, room after room, passage after passage, each leading to another turn, another staircase, another shadow. When you entered Knossos, you did not walk straight. You wound. You turned left, then right, then descended a stair that seemed to vanish into darkness. You came upon storerooms where great jars of oil and wine were stacked high, each jar tall enough to reach your waist. You might emerge into a courtyard where sunlight spilled down and frescoes covered the walls in brilliant reds and blues, and then just as suddenly, you would be swallowed again by a narrow corridor, torchlit and twisting. It was this feeling of never being able to see all at once, of being lost, even while inside a home, that gave birth to the story of the Labyrinth. The Greeks later said there was a monster within, the Minotaur, half man and half bull, who devoured those unlucky enough to wander into his maze. But in truth, the monster was the palace itself. Its design confused, disoriented, and swallowed anyone who dared to enter without a guide. But Knossos was not just walls and corridors. It was alive with people. Servants hurried along passages carrying food for feasts. Craftsmen worked in chambers, chiseling stone or painting the delicate details of dolphins, lilies, and griffins upon plaster. Priests and priestesses moved through sacred halls, where columns painted red and black stood like forest trunks. Surrounding altars where offerings smoked, there were rooms for rulers, rooms for priests, rooms for storage, and rooms for mystery. Some say there were theaters where dances were performed, open courtyards where acrobats leapt over the horns of charging bulls. Imagine the cheers of the crowd as a young man grasped a bull by its horns, vaulted into the air, and landed gracefully on the creature's back before leaping free. It was a dance with death, and it became the heart of their myth. And yet, at night, Knossos grew quiet. The echo of footsteps faded, the flicker of torches made shadows dance across painted walls. Somewhere, an owl cried in the distance, and in those moments you could almost believe that the labyrinth was alive, breathing, waiting, keeping secrets that no one could fully know. The Greeks later told of King Minos, who ruled from Knossos, and of Daedalus, the genius craftsman who built the labyrinth to hold the Minotaur. They told of Ariadne, who gave Theseus a ball of thread so he could find his way back after killing the beast. But perhaps the myths were born from something simpler, the unsettling experience of walking those halls. Imagine being a child, wandering too far from your family, and suddenly realizing you cannot find a courtyard again. Every stair looks the same. Every corridor twists in the same direction. Fear rises. Your footsteps echo louder and louder. And then in the silence, you feel as though something unseen is following you. Out of such feelings, monsters are born. For centuries, Knossos thrived. Its people traded across the seas, bringing tin from distant lands, gold from Egypt, and stories from everywhere in between. But then it was silenced. A great eruption shook the world. The island of Thera, now called Santorini, exploded in fire and ash. The sea rose, the skies darkened, and the Minoans, as they are now called, began to fade. Whether by wave, by famine, or by invasion, their voices grew quiet, their frescoes cracked, and Knossos fell into ruin. The labyrinth remained, but now it was empty. Owls nested in the rafters. Lizards darted across broken tiles. Grass grew between stones, and the stories grew louder than the voices of the people who once lived there. By the time the Greeks of later centuries came to Crete, they no longer remembered the true purpose of the palace. They saw only its endless corridors, its crumbling walls, and its mysterious silence. And so they filled that silence with myth, a beast in the dark, a hero with a sword, a thread that led out of terror and into safety. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are there. The air is cool, the stone is smooth beneath your hands. You hold a torch, its flame flickering and bending with the drafts of hidden passages. Your footsteps echo strangely, bouncing back in ways that confuse your sense of direction. Turn left. A chamber opens, painted with dolphins leaping joyfully over waves. Turn right. A stair climbs upward, but where does it lead? You descend instead into darkness where jars taller than yourself stand in silent ranks, their bellies once filled with oil and grain. You feel the weight of the labyrinth pressing in. You do not know how far you have come, nor how to return. And for a moment you wonder, is there something else here? Something watching? Or is it only your own breath, loud in the silence, that makes you think so? That is the labyrinth's gift. Not just to confuse the body, but to stir the mind, to make you question what is real and what is imagined. Knossos, there was not only a place of stone and storerooms, it was a sacred stage. The people who lived there believed their survival depended on rituals, acts performed not just for themselves, but for the gods who walked invisibly among them. In the grand courtyards fires were lit. Priests poured wine upon the ground as libation. The smell of burning grain, herbs, and sometimes even flesh rose into the sky, smoke curling upward like a bridge to the divine. Each act was careful, deliberate, repeated as it had been for generations. To the Minoans, the world was fragile. The sea could bless them with fish or drown their ships. The earth could yield crops or crack open with earthquake. To live was to constantly bargain with unseen powers. The palace was both a home and a temple, its corridors leading not just to storage rooms, but to sacred chambers where the gods were invited to dwell. Above all symbols, none was more sacred than the bull. Its strength, its horns, its breath, all carry power. Frescoes on the palace walls show young men and women leaping over the backs of bulls, hands gripping the horns, bodies twisting midair in impossible grace. Was it sport? Was it ritual? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the Minoans saw in the bull not just danger, but the raw energy of life itself. To leap over the bull was to prove mastery not only of the beast, but of fate. It is easy to see how such spectacles grew into stories. To later Greeks, the bull was no longer only an animal. It became the Minotaur, born of sin, trapped within the twisting halls, hungry for human flesh. Theseus, the hero, was sent inside. He fought not only the beast, but the terror of the unknown, the dread of endless corridors. He won not only with courage, but with cleverness, the thread that led him back. Every myth is a memory disguised, and the Minotaur may simply have been the echo of the bull leapers, the dancers who faced horns and hooves in the bright courtyards of Knossos. But bulls were not the only symbols. In the ruins of Knossos, archaeologists found small statues of women, their arms outstretched, serpents coiled around them. Their bare breasts were uncovered, their skirts wide and patterned. To us, they are known as the snake goddesses. To the Minoans, they may have represented the power of fertility, of renewal, of death and rebirth. The snake sheds its skin and emerges new. What greater symbol of life cycle could there be? Imagine walking into a chamber lit by torches, the air heavy with incense. A priestess raises such a figure, her eyes closed, her voice chanting. Around her, worshippers bow low, offering bread, honey, or oil. The snakes are not feared, they are revered. They move silently, cold and watchful, as if carrying secrets from the underworld. The palace itself, filled with winding corridors and hidden chambers, was like a snake, twisting, circling, always leading deeper. It is no wonder that the Minoans believed their gods lived within such forms. When the sun set, Knossos did not sleep entirely. Torches flickered in the courtyards, their flames casting long shadows across painted dolphins and lilies. The sea wind sighed through open windows. From deep chambers, the drip of water echoed, slow and steady. Servants carried lamps as they tended to their duties, checking storerooms, covering jars, locking doors. A priest or priestess might walk barefoot through the halls, whispering prayers in the silence. Outside, the stars glittered over the Cretan hills, and the sea beyond whispered against the shore. It was in this silence that the labyrinth became most alive. Without the noise of daytime bustle, the palace breathed differently. Each step echoed more loudly. Each shadow seemed to stretch longer. One could almost imagine a beast waiting just around the corner, horns glinting in torchlight, eyes glowing in the dark. Knossos was never empty, even when no one was there. Its walls held stories, and its silence whispered them to those who dared to listen. Generations later, when the Greeks told tales of Theseus, Ariadne, and the Minotaur, they were not only inventing stories, they were remembering. They remembered the twisting halls that disoriented them. They remembered the bull dances where life and death balanced on the tip of a horn. They remembered the snake priestesses whose eyes glowed in firelight. They remembered the palace itself, vast and strange, like a god's dwelling more than a king's. And from those memories, myth grew. The labyrinth became eternal, not only a ruin of stone, but a story that still weaves through our minds. Every palace, no matter how grand, meets its end. For Knossos, the decline was slow, like a candle burning down. It began with tremors beneath the earth. The island of Thera, now called Santorini, erupted in fire and ash. The sky darkened. Waves rose high upon the sea. Ships were broken, ports swallowed. For a people who lived by the sea, this was disaster beyond measure. Crops failed. Trade slowed. Famine crept in. And with weakness came enemies. Other powers from across the Aegean saw their chance. Step by step, the proud palace of Knossos began to lose its voice. The frescoes still shone, the courtyard still filled with dancers, but outside, the world was shifting. The sea that once blessed them now cursed them. The gods they had worshipped with fire and song seemed suddenly distant. And then silence. Imagine Knossos after its people had gone. The great jars in the storerooms stood empty, their mouths yawning to the dark. The courtyards, once filled with laughter, echoed only with the cries of birds. Ivy curled up the painted walls, covering dolphins and lilies in green. The labyrinth remained, but without people to fill it, it became something different. No longer a palace, no longer a home. It became a ruin. Travelers came upon it and shook their heads. They walked the twisting halls and could not make sense of them. Why so many rooms? Why so many stairs? They told stories to explain it. They said there must have been a monster here, trapped within. They said heroes must have come to fight it. And so the silence was filled not by voices, but by myths. Centuries passed. The palace lay under the weight of time, its stones buried, its walls broken. For most, Knossos was nothing more than a tale, a half-remembered story. But in the early 20th century, a man named Arthur Evans walked the island of Crete, with curiosity burning in his mind. He had read of the labyrinth in Greek myth. He had wondered if it was only legend or if it had roots in stone. He dug. He brushed away earth. He uncovered fragments of walls, shards of pottery, faint traces of frescoes. Piece by piece, Knossos emerged again into the light. For Evans, it was as though myth had stepped into reality. Here were the corridors, winding and confusing. Here were the storerooms, vast and echoing. Here were the painted dolphins, leaping eternally over faded waves. The labyrinth was real. Not a prison for monsters, but a palace for a people who lived thousands of years before. Today, you can walk those ruins yourself. You can place your hand upon stone smoothed by centuries of touch. You can look upon the restored frescoes, bright once more. You can walk the stairs that lead down and down again into silence. And though there is no Minotaur waiting for you, the feeling is the same. The air cools, the corridors twist, shadows lengthen, and a thought whispers at the back of your mind, what if I do not find my way back That is the gift of Knossos. Even in ruin, even in silence, it still speaks. It reminds us that history is not dead. It lives in walls and stones, in myths and memories. It lives in the stories we tell to make sense of what we cannot fully understand. And when the night is quiet, when your eyes grow heavy, you may still find yourself wandering those endless corridors and dreams, following the faint glow of a torch, listening for the sound of your own footsteps as they echo through the dark. The Labyrinth of Knossos may be the most famous, but it was not the only one. Across the world, cultures have drawn spirals, mazes, and winding paths. In ancient Egypt, there were stories of a labyrinth so vast it held thousands of chambers, each more mysterious than the last. In the far north, the Vikings laid out stone labyrinths by the sea, places where fishermen would walk before setting out to calm the waves and confuse evil spirits. In medieval Europe, cathedrals carved labyrinths into their floors, not to trap monsters, but to guide the faithful. Pilgrims would walk those patterns slowly, step by step, as if journeying toward heaven. Every labyrinth in every land carried the same whisper: life is not straight. It bends, it turns, it confuses. You may think you are lost, but often you are still on the path. Think of the story of Ariadne's thread, a simple ball of yarn offered in love and wisdom, guiding Theseus back from the darkness. Perhaps that is the truest heart of the labyrinth. Not the monster, not the walls, but the thread. The reminder that in confusion, in fear, in long nights of wandering, we can find a line to hold. Sometimes it is faith, sometimes it is memory, sometimes it is the hand of another person reaching out in the dark. Whatever form it takes, the thread reminds us that no path is endless, no confusion eternal. There is always a way through. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are walking such a path. The air is cool. The walls rise high on either side. You take one step, then another. The path curves. You turn. You walk on. It may feel as though you circle endlessly, but in truth, the labyrinth is not meant to trap you. It is meant to carry you inward to the center where silence waits. And then, when you are ready, it carries you back out again, step by step, toward light, toward dawn, toward rest. The Labyrinth of Knossos may have been stone, but the labyrinth of the mind is built of thoughts and dreams. To walk it slowly is to accept the mystery of life, not to solve it, but to breathe within it. And so, Knossos endures. It endures not as it once was, with kings and priestesses, bull leapers and servants. It endures as memory, as myth, as symbol. Its stones remind us that civilizations rise and fall. Its frescoes remind us that beauty can outlast voices. Its labyrinth reminds us that even in confusion, we can still find meaning. Tonight, as you drift deeper into rest, let Knossos be a dream. Imagine its long corridors, its torch-lit chambers, its silent stairways. Imagine the thread in your hand, soft and steady, leading you always forward. Imagine the silence at the center, calm and eternal, and know that you, too, will find your way through. When we think of ancient war, we often imagine a single clash, armies charging, swords clashing, a battle ending in an afternoon. But in truth, many of history's great conflicts were not quick storms of violence. They were long winters of waiting. A siege was not just a fight. It was a season. To besiege a city was to surround it, to choke it slowly, to press it into silence day by day. It could last weeks, months, sometimes years. For those outside the walls, the siege was hard work. For those within, it was life and death stretched thin across time. Cities were born of walls. To build a wall was to declare safety, to say, "Here we live, and here you may not pass." Stone upon stone, high and thick, walls rose around towns and palaces. Gates were carved from heavy timbers bound with iron. Towers rose so that archers might look down upon the plain. To attackers, those walls were not just barriers, they were challenges. To breach them was to prove mastery. To stand before them was to feel dwarfed by the endurance of stone. And so, across centuries, the art of siege was born. The simplest, and perhaps the oldest of siege engines, was the ram. A tree, cut and shaped, its trunk shod in iron, suspended by ropes, covered by a wooden roof, it swung forward again and again until the gates cracked, until the timbers groaned. From within the city, defenders hurled stones, shot arrows, poured down boiling water or oil. They dropped heavy beams upon the ram's roof, trying to break it. Smoke filled the air, men shouted, wood splintered, and still the ram swung. Imagine standing there, hour after hour, listening to that sound, thud, 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 as the great trunk slammed into the gate. For defenders, it was the sound of doom drawing near. For attackers, it was the heartbeat of victory. But not every wall could be broken by rams. Some were too strong, too thick, and so came machines to hurl stones. The catapult, the ballista, the great arms of wood and rope that could fling rocks heavier than a man across the sky. They whistled as they flew, crashed as they struck. A single stone could shatter a tower's corner, collapse a roof, crush a group of soldiers standing close. At night, fire was tied to the missiles. Flaming bundles arced through the dark sky, landing upon roofs, barns, granaries. From within the city, families watched their food stores burn, their homes collapse, the night sky glowing red. In time, the mightiest of these machines was born, the trebuchet. Unlike the catapult, which relied on twisted ropes, the trebuchet used balance and weight. A great arm, one end heavy with stone, the other cradling a sling. When released, the arm swung with the slow grace of inevitability, hurling its missile far and with crushing force. It could throw not only stones, but anything. Barrels of fire, carcasses of animals, even at times the bodies of the dead, cast into the city to spread fear or plague. To hear the trebuchet was to hear inevitability itself. The slow creak as the arm was drawn back, the pause as it held, waiting, and then the release. The arm swinging, the sling whipping forward, the stone flying. A long silence as it cut through the air, and then the crash, the roar, the fall of stone upon stone. But to truly understand a siege, you must not only stand outside the walls, you must also step inside. At first, life might seem unchanged. The gates closed, the markets still opened, bread was still baked, children still laughed in the courtyards. But as days stretched into weeks and weeks into months, supplies grew thin. Flour dwindled. Salted meat was rationed. Water grew stale in cisterns. The wealthy survived longer, their storerooms filled with grain. The poor suffered first. Dogs and cats vanished from the streets. Rats became food. Hunger hollowed cheeks, slowed footsteps, turned laughter into silence. And always the fear. Each thud of the ram, each crash of a stone, reminded them that walls were not eternal. Among the most formidable machines rolled against the walls was the siege tower. Imagine it, a wooden giant rising as high as the battlements it sought to conquer. Built from heavy beams, clad in hide soaked with water to resist fire, it creaked forward on wheels. pushed by dozens of men. Inside, soldiers climbed ladders, ascending floor by floor until they reached the top. From that top platform, they could look straight across at the defenders. Arrows flew, stones were hurled, bridges were lowered from the tower to the wall, and suddenly the battle was not below but face to face across narrow planks above the abyss. For defenders, the tower's approach was terror itself. They lit torches, flung pots of pitch, rolled great stones from the walls to crush its wheels. They prayed the tower would catch fire before it reached them. For once it touched the wall, the enemy was no longer outside. They were at your side, steel against steel. But not all battles were fought in the open. Some took place in darkness beneath the earth. Attackers would dig tunnels under the walls, propping them with timber. Fires were then lit. The timbers burned away, and the ground collapsed, bringing down the stone above. A sudden rumble, a roar of dust, and a section of wall might fall, opening a breach. Defenders listened for the scrape of picks beneath their feet. They pressed their ears to the ground, listening in silence for the faint echo of digging. And when they heard it, they dug their own tunnels to meet the enemy below. In those cramped, airless spaces, battles were fought with smoke, fire, and desperation. A tunnel collapse could bury men alive. To fight underground was to fight the earth itself, choking in dust and heat, striking at shadows with little room to swing a blade. Yet those within the city were not without cunning. Defenders poured boiling water, hot sand, or quicklime from above. Hot sand poured into armor seared the flesh of those beneath. Beehives were thrown upon attackers, releasing furious swarms. Pitch and tar were set aflame, dripping fire onto heads and shields. Even stones became weapons. Women and children carried baskets of rocks to the walls, hurling them down. A wall was not just stone. It was alive with resistance, and sometimes trickery won the day. False gates were built to lure rams. Secret passages opened to allow sudden sallies. Quick strikes by defenders who rushed out, set fire to siege engines, and fled back before the enemy could react. But perhaps the greatest enemy in siege was not fire or stone, but time itself. Night fell, and the battlefield did not vanish. Fires burned in camps outside the walls, their glow visible from every tower. Soldiers inside the city lay awake, listening. Would the enemy attack under cover of dark? Would ladders suddenly appear against the walls? Would shouts rise and torches flare? The city was silent, but it was not restful. Mothers hushed their children. Guards paced the battlements, eyes straining into shadow. Each sound, the crack of wood, the cry of an owl, the shuffle of boots, seemed louder, sharper, filled with dread. And for those in the camps, the night was no gentler. Men tried to sleep upon the cold ground, listening to the wind through the grass, to the uneasy shifting of horses, to the groan of siege engines as they settled. Some prayed, some sharpened blades, some stared into the fire with hollow eyes. A siege was a war of patience, and patience at night was the hardest of all. Not all battles in a siege were fought with stones and steel. Many were fought in silence, in whispers, in fear. An enemy who could not break a wall might instead break the spirit of those behind it. Siege engines hurled not only rocks, but also the carcasses of animals, spreading disease and despair. Sometimes the bodies of captured soldiers were flung back over the walls, reminders that no help would come, that death was near. At night, drums beat slowly outside the walls, echoing like a heartbeat that could not be silenced. Fires burned bright so the defenders could see how many men stood waiting in the dark. Songs of war were sung, chants shouted, not to inspire the enemy, but to remind them of their weakness. Fear seeped into the stone, into the marrow of those who waited. In a siege, you did not need to strike every day. You needed only to be patient and let dread do the work for you. Inside the walls, hunger was the great enemy. At first, bread was rationed, markets grew quiet. People stood in long lines for food, hoping the baker still had flour. Salted meat was cut thinner, stretched further. Cisterns of water were guarded, their levels checked each day. Then, as weeks turned into months, desperation grew. Dogs vanished from the streets. Cats disappeared. Rats became a prize. Bark was stripped from trees. Weeds boiled into soup. Parents gave their children what little they could, even as their own strength faded. Hunger hollowed the eyes, slowed the step, silenced the laughter of children, and with hunger came sickness. Weak bodies could not fight disease. A cough spread through the alleys. A fever burned in the huts. A city could fall not from broken walls, but from empty stomachs. Siege was a test of time. For those outside, each day was a cycle of building, firing, waiting. For those inside, each day was a struggle to endure. Months might pass without progress. Seasons might change. Snow falling on tents. Spring flowers blooming outside walls that still held firm. The patience required was immense. Armies far from home grew restless. Defenders who saw no rescue grew hopeless. And always the question, who would last longer? The besiegers, with their supplies stretched thin, disease spreading through the camp, or the besieged, starving in silence, waiting for allies who might never come. The siege was not only a battle of bodies, it was a battle of wills. And yet, sometimes in the long stillness, moments of humanity flickered. There were stories of brief truces when both sides paused to collect their dead or even to trade. A few sheep for a sack of grain, a pitcher of wine for a bag of salt. In some sieges, soldiers on opposite sides shouted jokes across the walls, voices carrying in the night. But these were fleeting. The next day, the ram swung again. The stones flew. The hunger gnawed. In the end, war always returned. At last, after weeks, months, sometimes years, the moment came. A section of wall collapsed under the hammering of stones. The gates cracked beneath the ram. Or the defenders, weakened by hunger, opened their doors themselves, hoping for mercy. The breach was sudden, but it was never gentle. Soldiers poured in with shouts, shields raised, blades drawn. Inside, the weak and the weary could do little. Some tried to fight, striking with kitchen knives, farm tools, whatever they had. Others fled through alleys, seeking a place to hide. Mothers gathered their children close, praying that someone would show pity. But sieges were rarely merciful. To the victors went the spoils. And in the ancient world, spoils meant everything that could be carried. Granaries were emptied, cellars of wine were drained, gold and silver were seized, loaded onto carts, temples were plundered, statues toppled, fire spread, devouring homes, markets, even sacred places, and lives were taken, men cut down in the streets, women and children taken as captives. Sometimes entire populations were enslaved, marched away from the city that had been their world. The survivors carried only memories, and even those were heavy. A city that had stood for centuries could be erased in a single day of fury. When the shouting ended, silence fell. Streets once filled with footsteps were empty. Smoke hung in the air, rising from charred timbers. The walls still stood, but within them there was little life. The stones themselves seemed to mourn, blackened and broken. For those who lived through it, the silence was heavier than the sound of battle. It was the silence of loss, of knowing that what had been home was gone forever. And yet, people remembered. They told stories of the long nights, of the hunger, of the sound of rams against gates. They spoke of bravery, of men who stood until the end, of women who carried stones to the walls, of children who endured hunger with quiet strength. They also spoke of cruelty, of betrayal, of starvation, of the day the walls fell. These stories were passed down not only as warnings, but as lessons to build stronger walls, to store more grain, to prepare better, but also perhaps to remember that patience and endurance could sometimes withstand even the mightiest army. Today, when we stand before ruined walls in Troy, in Carthage, in Jerusalem, in countless cities whose names we have forgotten, we can still feel it. The quiet weight of siege lingers in the stone. It whispers of waiting, of hunger, of fear. It tells us that war is not always swift. Often it is slow, grinding, endless. And it reminds us that in those long nights, the truest strength was not in engines or rams, but in human endurance, the will to survive one more day and then another until the dawn finally came. Long before steel cannons or stone castles, there was Troy. Its walls stood tall above the plains, shining in the sun, said to be touched by gods themselves. For 10 long years, armies camped before them. The siege was not constant battle, but long waiting. Days of stillness, broken by sudden bursts of fighting near the gates. Food ran low in the Greek camps. Quarrels broke out among kings who were tired of waiting. Inside Troy, the people prayed to their gods, trusting the walls that had never fallen. 10 years is a long time to wait. An entire generation of children grew, learning to walk and talk within those walls under the shadow of war. Some may have thought the Greeks would one day leave, that Troy would remain forever. But the end came not from brute force, but from patience and trickery. A wooden horse, standing silent before the gates, was rolled inside. In the stillness of night, hidden warriors climbed out, and Troy burned. The siege of Troy reminds us walls may hold, hunger may be endured, but time itself is the greatest enemy. Centuries later, another city met its end, Carthage, proud jewel of North Africa. Its harbors were full of ships, its markets rich with goods from across the seas. Rome, its rival, could not allow such power to remain. The Romans encircled Carthage. For 3 years, the city endured. Inside, hunger grew sharp, yet the people held on. Carthaginian children grew thin, soldiers grew desperate, but the walls still stood. When at last the Romans broke through, there was no mercy. The city was burned. Survivors were sold into slavery, and legend says the earth itself was salted, so nothing might grow where Carthage had once stood. Was the salt real? Perhaps not. But the story endures, a symbol of final destruction. It teaches us that sieges did not always end with survival. Sometimes nothing remained but silence. In the year 70 of our era, the Roman legions came again, this time to Jerusalem. The city was holy, the temple a sacred heart. Yet walls, no matter how sacred, cannot hold forever. The Romans surrounded the city at Passover, when thousands of pilgrims had gathered. Food dwindled quickly. Hunger gnawed like a beast at every household. Stories tell of desperation so great that even the unthinkable occurred. Families torn by famine. Inside, Factions fought each other even as the Romans built their siege engines outside. Fire and sword finished what hunger began. The temple burned, its stones toppled. For the survivors, exile followed. And still today, the memory of that siege shapes history, a wound that echoes across centuries. And then, much later, came Constantinople, a city of walls so strong they were said to be unbreakable. For 1,000 years they had held. Crusaders had once breached them by betrayal, but never had an enemy broken them by force. In 1453, the Ottomans came with something new. Cannon, vast and terrible, hurling iron balls that shook the earth. Day after day they fired, until even stone walls cracked and crumbled. Inside, priests carried icons through the streets. People prayed, voices rising in defiance. But no prayer could stop the thunder of the guns. At dawn on May 29th, the final assault came. Walls shattered, gates splintered. The city that had been the last light of Rome was taken. Its name changed, but its memory endures. These 4 sieges show us that time, hunger, patience, and new machines were all weapons as sharp as any sword. When we imagine war, we often think of flashing swords, the crash of armor, or the roar of battle. But a siege was mostly long days of waiting. Soldiers pitched their tents in rings around the city, sometimes stretching for miles. Wooden palisades or trenches were dug to protect the besiegers from sudden attacks. Fires burned at night, and the camp became a city of its own. In the daylight, soldiers worked as laborers as much as warriors. They cut trees, shaping timber into rams or towers. They hauled stones, building engines and barricades. The rhythm of hammers striking wood, saws rasping through beams, and iron being forged echoed across the fields. This labor was endless, heavy, and repetitive. When work was done, there was boredom. Soldiers sat by their fires throwing dice, telling stories of home, or listening for rumors about when the walls might fall. Some gambled away their meager pay, others sang or carved wood to pass the hours. But the camp was no place of comfort. Food spoiled quickly. Water turned foul. Flies gathered in clouds carrying sickness from one tent to another. Dysentery, fever, and plague often spread faster than victory. Many who died during sieges never touched a blade. They perished from disease in the stinking air of the camp. Night in a siege camp was uneasy. Fires flickered, guards walked the lines. Always there was fear. Would the defenders sally out, charging suddenly through the gates? Would spies slip among the tents, setting fire to engines? The camp listened to the sounds of the city at night. Dogs barking, voices carrying across the dark, the toll of bells, sometimes even the cries of hungry children. These sounds reminded the soldiers that a whole world lived just beyond the walls, out of reach. For generals, a siege was a test of patience. Every day they measured the progress of sappers, the strength of rams, the cracks in the walls. They gathered their men, gave speeches, and promised victory. Yet privately, they worried. How long could their supplies last? Would reinforcements come for the defenders? Would their own soldiers grow restless? Commanders had to balance cruelty and mercy. Too harsh, and their own men might desert. Too soft, and the defenders would not fear them. Some ordered crucifixions or hangings of captured enemies within sight of the walls, as grim messages. Others allowed prisoners to live, hoping word of mercy would encourage surrender. Inside the besieged city, another camp formed, not of tents, but of households. Every family rationed food. Bread grew thinner, wine watered down, meat scarce. Horses, once noble mounts, were slaughtered. Cats and dogs vanished from the streets. In some places, even leather or grass was boiled for nourishment. The people clung to hope. Priests led processions, carrying relics along the walls, chanting prayers to strengthen the hearts of those within. Mothers comforted children, though their own eyes were hollow with hunger. Merchants who once sold spices and silks now traded scraps of dried fruit or handfuls of grain as treasure. But tension simmered. Factions blamed each other for weakness. Sometimes citizens rose against their own leaders, demanding surrender. Other times, soldiers forced silence on the fearful, insisting the city would never fall. Both sides endured, day after day, night after night. The siege became not only a battle of weapons, but a contest of time and will. Which side would give in first? The weary soldiers outside or the starving people within? The campfires burned, the walls stood. The waiting stretched into weeks, then months. And through it all, life went on, messy, fragile, and uncertain. Not every weapon was made of wood or iron. Many were shaped of fear. Armies outside the walls would beat drums through the night, keeping defenders awake. Horns would sound suddenly echoing in the dark, so that every shadow looked like an assault. Sometimes, soldiers lit extra fires or marched in circles, making their numbers seem endless. Inside, fear grew like smoke. Hunger gnawed, yes, but dread gnawed deeper. Mothers hushed their children, telling them not to cry, for the enemy would hear. Men kept watch on the walls, staring into the night until their eyes burned, wondering if every rustle of grass hid a creeping figure. Sieges bred strange cruelties. Attackers sometimes hurled corpses of the dead over the walls, their own comrades or the city's fallen, hoping to spread sickness or despair. Diseased animals were flung from catapults, their broken bodies bursting in the streets. These were not only weapons of flesh, but of terror. Others sent taunting notes, tied to arrows, mocking the hunger of those within. Sometimes, prisoners were paraded before the walls, tortured within sight of their kin, a silent message that resistance would bring the same. Some commanders turned to cunning. A false retreat might lure defenders out, only for hidden soldiers to spring an ambush. Spies within the city might spread rumors that reinforcements would never come, that the walls were cursed, that the leaders had already betrayed them. Even the weather was used. A sudden storm might be framed as divine judgment, a sign that the gods had chosen the attacker's side. Defenders, weary and frightened, sometimes believed such omens. Yet amid cruelty and hunger, legends were born. Stories tell of cities where men and women fought until the very end, preferring death to surrender. In Carthage, flames lit the sky as defenders made their final stand. In Masada, atop a desert cliff, Jewish rebels chose to die by their own hands rather than fall to Roman chains. Other legends spoke of miracles, of walls holding against all odds, of visions appearing to comfort the starving, of unexpected reinforcements arriving at the last moment. These tales grew with time, becoming more myth than fact, yet carrying a truth, that hope itself was a weapon. When the walls finally fell, when fire licked the stones and silence followed, memory remained. Survivors carried the stories for generations. The hunger, the fear, the long nights by the fire, the sudden roar of engines breaking walls, all became lessons. Even ruins, remember? Stones cracked by rams, earth scorched by fire, fields where camps once stood. They whisper of endurance and despair. And every story of a siege reminds us that war is not only fought with swords, but with patience, with time, with fear, and with will. Not every moment of the Middle Ages was filled with war or fear. Beyond the castles and sieges, life was lived in simple rhythms: dawn, work, meals, rest, and prayer. To understand the medieval world, we must look not only at kings and battles, but at the quiet, ordinary days of the people who filled the fields, the streets, and the chapels. A medieval morning began not with clocks, but with light. When the first gray glow touched the horizon, roosters crowed, church bells rang, and families stirred from their sleep. Beds were simple: straw mattresses, wool blankets, sometimes shared by several children together. The first tasks were humble: tending the fire, fetching water, feeding animals. In villages, the sound of buckets clattering at wells was the song of mourning. Smoke curled from cottage chimneys as women stirred pots of porridge or baked coarse bread. Children carried baskets, chasing goats or gathering kindling. In castles, mornings were also busy. Servants swept the rushes from great halls, laid fresh reeds on the floors, polished armor, and prepared meals. Lords and ladies, dressed with the help of attendants, donning wool, linen, or fur depending on the season. For peasants, life was tied to the land. Fields stretched out from the village, divided into strips worked by families. Men plowed with oxen, turning heavy soil. Women followed, scattering seed by hand. Children shooed away birds, their laughter mingling with the cries of crows. Each season brought its own labor. Spring was for planting, summer for weeding and haymaking, autumn for harvest, winter for mending tools and tending animals indoors. Work was constant, and the body bore its mark: calloused hands, bent backs, weathered faces. Yet there was also pride. The harvest meant survival: bread for the table, ale for the cup. Meals were simple but filling. Bread was the heart of the diet: dark rye or barley loaves in peasant homes, finer white wheat bread in noble halls. Stews of beans, peas, and cabbage simmered in iron pots, flavored with a little meat when fortune allowed. On feast days, chickens, pigs, or venison roasted over spits, filling the air with smoke and rich scent. Ale was drunk by nearly all, for water was often unsafe. Children drank weak ale, while adults enjoyed stronger brews. In southern lands, wine was common, carried in clay jars or wooden barrels. Milk, cheese, and butter added richness when cows or goats produced enough. Faith was the thread woven through every day. Bells rang for prayer, morning, noon, and evening. In villages, the church stood at the center, its steeple visible above thatched roofs. Sundays brought rest from labor, though work of necessity, feeding animals, tending fires, never ceased. Festivals marked the year: Christmas, Easter, harvest feasts, saints' days. These were times of joy, when music, dancing, and games filled the village square. Even the poorest shared what they had, for festivals reminded all that life was not only toil. Monks in monasteries lived by an even stricter rhythm, rising before dawn for chants, working in fields or scriptoria, and returning to prayer throughout the day. Their lives were devoted to God, but also to labor and learning, keeping knowledge alive when much of the world struggled. As the sun set, work slowed. Families gathered in cottages lit by firelight. Shadows flickered across wooden beams. Parents told stories or sang songs while children drifted to sleep on straw beds. In castles, the great hall glowed with torches. Music played. Dogs lay by the fire. Nobles dined on roasted meats and spiced wine. Outside the walls, peasants looked to the stars marking the passage of seasons. Night brought both fear and wonder, the howl of wolves, the silence of fields, the mystery of dreams. And so the cycle turned day after day, season after season. It was a life of hardship, yes, but also of endurance, community, and quiet joys. Not all medieval folk worked the land. Villages and towns had craftsmen whose skills kept communities alive. Blacksmiths hammered at forges, sparks rising with every strike, shaping plowshares, nails, and horseshoes. Carpenters cut and fitted beams for homes and barns. Masons laid stones, building walls that outlasted generations. Women, too, held crafts, weaving cloth, spinning wool, dyeing with herbs, brewing ale. Children learned by watching, by helping, by carrying tools. A boy might sweep the smithy until one day he was allowed to hold a hammer. A girl might card wool until she learned to weave at the loom. Towns bustled with trade. Market stalls displayed vegetables, cloth, pottery, fish, or salt. The smell of smoked meat mingled with the scent of fresh bread. Merchants called out their prices, coins clinked, and deals were struck with handshakes. Markets were more than commerce. They were social, alive with gossip, news, and laughter. Though life was hard, festivals gave relief. May Day brought dancing around poles adorned with ribbons. Harvest festivals offered thanks for the gathered grain with songs and feasting. At midsummer, bonfires blazed, sparks rising into the warm night air. Carnival before Lent filled towns with masks and music. Jesters played tricks, musicians struck lively tunes, and for a few days the world turned upside down. Peasants could mock lords, fools could wear crowns, all before solemn fasting returned. Weddings were joyous, binding families and villages together. The whole community often joined, carrying gifts of bread, cheese, or ale. Dancing feet stamped the earth, fiddles and pipes sang through the evening, and torches lit the way as the new couple was led to their home. Illness was a constant shadow. Without modern knowledge, cures were a mixture of herbal remedies, prayers, and superstition. A woman might brew a tea of chamomile for fevers or willow bark for pain. Monks grew gardens of healing herbs, sage, mint, rosemary, recording their uses in manuscripts. Yet fear lingered. Plagues swept through towns, leaving silence in their wake. The Black Death carried away millions, and its memory haunted generations. People blamed bad air, divine punishment, or unlucky stars. Doctors in long robes and strange beaked masks became symbols of dread. But in daily life, smaller remedies mattered. A poultice of honey on a wound, garlic hung to ward off sickness, prayers whispered at bedsides. Healing was as much faith as science. The medieval year was bound to the seasons. Spring brought plowing and planting, summer long days of work and sun. Autumn was the season of gratitude and exhaustion, barns filled, grain stored, ale brewed. Winter was lean, cold, and long, with families gathered close around fires. Clocks and calendars mattered little to most. The sun, the stars, and the church bells guided life. Days were measured by light and labor, nights by fire and rest. Daily life in the Middle Ages was not only struggle, but also texture. The creak of wagon wheels on muddy roads, the clatter of hens in courtyards, the smell of smoke on wool clothing, the taste of warm bread after a long day. Children played with sticks, chased each other across fields, or carved little toys. Dogs barked, cats prowled, bells rang, hammers struck. It was a life of nearness, to the land, to each other, to faith. A life that may seem simple to us now, but one filled with meaning, endurance, and the small joys that carried people through long years. And now, our journey through history draws to its end. We have walked in the shadows of assassins, hidden in alleys and cloaked in fear. We have stood beside Olympias, the Serpent Queen, watching her wield power with fire in her voice and steel in her heart. We have wandered the winding corridors of Knossos, feeling the pull of the labyrinth, listening for the echo of a beast that may never have existed. We have endured the long nights of siege, hearing rams strike walls, smelling smoke, feeling the hunger and patience of armies. We have at last stepped into the cottages and fields of medieval people, living their days in simple rhythms, their nights in prayer, their lives in the quiet endurance of toil and joy. History is not only the story of kings and empires, but of survival, of hope, of voices that whisper through stone and parchment. And as you listen now, perhaps with eyes heavy and body resting, you too are part of this long story, the endless thread that weaves humanity across time. Imagine the assassins once more slipping into darkness, not as villains, but as desperate souls trying to endure. Imagine Olympias, fierce and unbending, shaped the fate of an empire through belief and will. Imagine the palace of Knossos, alive with color and myth, its labyrinth not a prison, but a path of the mind. Imagine the siege camps, the soldiers waiting, the families within walls whispering prayers against hunger. Imagine the peasant child chasing a goat in the fields, laughing in the sunlight centuries ago. All of them, in their own way, survived. All of them remind us that life, however fragile, however fleeting, carries meaning. And now, let the stories fade. Let the noise of war and work, of ritual and fear, grow quiet. Hear only your own breath, steady and soft. Let your eyes close as if behind stone walls, safe in a chamber warmed by fire. The night stretches on, but morning will come. If this story has brought you peace or guided you toward rest, I invite you to return again. Each week, new voices of the past will rise here, softly told, gently remembered. You may like this video or leave a quiet comment telling us where in the world you listened from. In doing so, you join a circle of listeners bound not by walls or swords, but by words and time. But for now, there is nothing more to do. The assassins vanish into shadow. Olympias sleeps at last. The labyrinth grows silent. The siege fires burn low, and the peasants rest beneath their thatched roofs. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply. Let the night carry you. Sleep well, traveler, until we meet again.